Daniel Stroud held my worn leather address book in his hand like it was some kind of joke prop, and in front of the entire family he flipped it open, read out loud the empty pages, and laughed. "Look at this," he said, his voice booming through the dining room. "Our mother, Evelyn Stroud, 74 years old, worked her whole life as a nurse, and she has, what, 2 numbers. Nobody cares enough to even call her empty." His wife, Laura, smiled with the kind of sharp amusement that cut deeper than words. My husband Harold sat in silence at the head of the table, staring at his plate, unwilling or unable to defend me. That moment was not only humiliating, it was the moment the ground under my feet gave way. I am Evelyn Stroud, 74 years old, retired nurse of a community hospital in Indiana. I spent decades tending to births and deaths, broken bones and weary hearts, stitching together not just wounds but families. I believed service would be remembered. Yet here I was, being laughed at in my own house, by my own son, as if the life I lived had been erased with the swipe of a page. Daniel, my eldest child, 53 now, built his name in business. He carried himself like the world owed him respect, and for years I allowed his arrogance to pass as confidence. I wanted to believe he was strong, carrying what his father could not. But that day, when he paraded my address book like evidence of my insignificance, I understood he was not protecting me, he was diminishing me. His wife Laura, 49, sharp-tongued, always polished, leaned into his mockery as though it was entertainment at my expense. The occasion was supposed to be Harold's birthday. Harold, my husband of 50-plus years, sat 2 chairs away from me, once a railway worker, now a man with tired eyes and weakened lungs. He looked worn down by years of labor. He said nothing while Daniel spoke, nothing while Laura smirked, nothing while I clenched my hands together under the table to stop them from trembling. That silence cut more than Daniel's words. The room smelled of roast beef and buttered rolls, but all I could taste was ash. My daughter Rebecca had not made it. She said the drive from Chicago was too long for just a small family dinner. My grandson Michael was absent too, busy with his first case at the law firm. So it was Daniel's stage, and I was the unwilling character in his performance. He laid the book flat on the table, tapping it with his finger like a gavel. "This is what happens when you don't keep up with the world, Mom. No contacts, no connections, nothing to show." His words weren't advice, they were judgment. The cruel laughter that followed from Laura was the applause. Harold kept chewing, slowly, deliberately, as though pretending not to hear would make the humiliation vanish. I did not rise from the table. I did not shout. Years of being a nurse taught me the value of stillness, of letting a fever break on its own before stepping in with medicine. But my mind raced with images. The patients I sat with through the night, the children I comforted when their mothers collapsed in grief, the elderly who clutched my hand as they slipped away. All of them were real, alive once, and yet, in that room, their memory meant nothing. After dinner, Daniel gathered plates like he owned the house. "We'll handle things from now on," he announced. Laura added, "It's time to streamline, simplify." They spoke in that practiced tone of children who believe they know better than their parents, who confuse control with care. I listened, my chest tight, while Harold nodded along, betraying me with the tilt of his head. Later that night, when the guests left and the dishes were stacked, I sat with Harold in the living room. The lamplight made his face look even older. "You should have said something," I whispered. He rubbed his temple and muttered, "It's not worth the fight. Not worth the fight." 50 years of marriage, and the man who once promised to stand beside me chose quiet surrender instead. The next morning I found the address book missing from the coffee table where Daniel had left it. When I asked Harold, he said, "Daniel took it. He said he'd digitize it for you." My throat went dry. That book was mine. Every name in it was a thread of my life. Even the empty pages carried weight. I had pressed flower petals in there from funerals I attended, written notes about birthdays long gone, scrawled reminders about families I promised to check on. It was not data to be digitized. It was proof I had lived. Days turned into weeks, and no book returned. Instead, I began to hear from neighbors that Daniel was talking about starting a new community health initiative, one that carried my name. People assumed I was involved. I was not. I had not been consulted. My name was being used like a stamp, my history converted into a business asset, while I was painted as the lonely old woman with an empty book. One afternoon, I walked into the pharmacy downtown and saw a flyer on the counter. Stroud Wellness, building tomorrow's health today. Underneath was my name in bold print. Inspired by the lifetime of service of Evelyn Stroud, my knees nearly buckled. Customers glanced at me, some with admiration, others with pity. They did not know I had never agreed to it, never even seen it until then. That evening, I confronted Harold again. He sat in his chair, remote in hand, television flickering across his glasses. "Did you know about this?" I asked, holding the flyer out. He hesitated too long, then he said softly, "Daniel told me. He said it would honor you." Honor. That word turned bitter on my tongue. Honor would have been returning my book. Honor would have been acknowledging my sacrifices without twisting them into profit. This was not honor, it was theft of memory. I did not scream. I folded the flyer carefully, slid it into my pocket, and walked upstairs. In the privacy of my room, I opened my closet and pulled out the small wooden box where I kept what little was truly mine: a silver watch from my father, a medal from the hospital for 20 years of service, and a stack of photographs with patients who had once called me their angel. I looked at them and wondered if they too would vanish one day, sold off or digitized into nothing. The humiliation of that birthday dinner, the silence of my husband, the theft of my book, and the exploitation of my name fused into one sharp realization. They were not just laughing at me, they were stripping me of the right to exist as I had been. I went to bed that night with the flyer under my pillow, a bitter talisman. My house felt less like a home and more like a stage where I had no lines, only the role of being quietly erased. The laughter from that dinner still echoed in my ears, louder than any machine I had ever heard in the hospital. I knew then that my story was no longer mine alone. It was being rewritten without my permission, and if I allowed it, soon there would be nothing left of Evelyn Stroud but a hollow address book and a borrowed name pasted on someone else's dream. That thought burned hotter than shame. It became the ember that would not die. A week after the birthday dinner, a courier dumped 2 heavy boxes on my porch, both stamped with a bright logo I had never seen: Stroud Wellness. Inside were glossy brochures with my name on the cover, my face from a decades-old hospital newsletter, and a quote I had never said. Beneath the photograph, a small printed signature: Villain Stroud, looked like mine but moved in a way my hand never had. I stood in my doorway holding a stack of paper that turned my life into decoration. The neighbors across the street waved as if a nice surprise had arrived. I carried the boxes inside and shut the door with my shoulder. I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, cheerful, busy, in control. He said the materials were foundational branding and that a photographer would stop by for a quick profile shot in front of the house. He said it would honor me. I told him he had no permission to use my name. He laughed softly, the way men do when they think they are being kind, while telling you it's already done. It's family, Mom. We're doing this together. I was 74, not naive. People lie to your face, but paper does not. The brochures listed a website, a phone number, an office address I didn't recognize. I set aside the top copy and started flipping. Page after page turned my years into marketing slogans, inspired by a lifetime of quiet service, rooted in humility. A mother, a caregiver, a legacy. Humility was not something you put in a font and sold. Humility was something you lived when no one was watching, when the monitor beeped, when the family cried, when the night stretched long and you could not leave because your shift was not done. Harold found me at the kitchen table. The boxes open, the brochures spread like a deck of cards. He touched the pile lightly, as if the paper might bruise. "It looks nice," he said, eyes on the floor. He was 76 now, my husband of half a century, a retired railman whose back said more than his mouth. "Did you know about this?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Daniel said it would be easier if things had a modern look. He reached to squeeze my shoulder and missed, his hand hovering over air. When the doorbell rang, Laura arrived with a smile and a garment bag. She was 49, polished, efficient, the kind of woman who made a plan and congratulated herself for sticking to it. "We'll keep this quick, Evelyn," she said, stepping past me with the garment bag and a makeup case, as if my home were a set. "You'll love the photos. We'll get you in a soft cardigan, trust me. It reads, 'Beloved' on camera." I told her there would be no photographs. She blinked, surprised for only a second, then switched to a tone she used on waiters when they misunderstood an order. "It's already scheduled." The photographer is on his way. I walked to the hallway and pulled my address book from the hall table out of habit, then remembered it was gone. Daniel had taken it, promising to digitize it. My hands reached into empty space and closed on air. Laura watched that small gesture and tucked it away. Adding it to whatever file in her head organized my habits into weaknesses. The photographer came and left without his shot. The only image he captured was the sight of me closing my own front door. He apologized. Laura did not. Daniel called from the car to scold me gently. "We need momentum, Mom. This is honoring your life's work." I told him my life's work didn't need a logo. He said, "The world does." After they left, quiet spread through the house like mist. I put on my coat and walked to the public library. The librarian still remembered me from the mornings I used to sit with new mothers and show them how to swaddle a fussy baby using nothing but patience and a thin blanket. I logged into a public computer and typed Stroud Wellness into the search bar. The website loaded with a clean white background and that same photo of me from years ago. The headline held my name in large letters. The story below recast me as a figure who had done small acts of kindness in an ordinary life that now found structure and vision under Daniel's leadership. Ordinary structure, vision, words rearranged to put him in the foreground. Me, in the past. There was a page titled, Our Story. It referred to me in the third person, as if I had already died. It said, I lived a modest career with minimal public recognition, and now, thanks to a family initiative, my legacy finds a proper home. I printed the page. The printer hummed and fed me the paper in warm sheets. I printed the About page, the Services page, and the Contact page. The list of contacts did not include me. While the printer worked, a teenager stapled a school flyer to the bulletin board. She glanced at the printouts, sliding into the tray, and recognized my photo. "That's you," she said, not a question. I nodded. Her eyes shifted from my face to the website headline and back. "Do you want me to post a notice online for you? There's a town group. Things move fast on there." The moral choice sat on the counter between usfat loud or collect proof. I thanked her and said I only needed a stapler. She handed it over. I pinned one of the printouts to the inside of my bag, not to the board, not yet. On the public board, there were notices for lost cats, piano lessons, a church bake sale. A small blank square of cork waited near the bottom. I pulled a lined index card from my purse and wrote a single sentence. "If I ever held your hand in a hard night, I'm hosting a small thank you Suno gifts. Just your name." I pinned it low where people have to bend to see, where anyone looking for the lost cat might notice. A woman with a grocery tote read the card, put her hand to her chest as if checking that her heart still sat where it should, and smiled at me without a word. I left the library with the pages tucked away like medicine. At home, a bank envelope waited in the mail pile. It included a welcome letter for a new authorized user on a card with my name embossed on the front. The user was Daniel. Harold had signed the authorization on a line that said joint account holder. I brought the letter to Harold and set it on the table where he ate his oatmeal. He pressed his finger to the paper and said, "It's for groceries, gas, things we need. He'll handle it better." The house was quiet enough that I could hear the spoon clink inside his bowl. I told him control was not care. He said we were getting older. The conversation ended not with agreement but with him swallowing his last bite and rinsing his bowl as if that settled things. The next morning I went to the bank with my purse snapped shut and my back straight. The manager sat with me in a glass office that felt like a fish tank. I showed her the letter. She was polite and careful. She explained that with Harold's signature as joint holder, Daniel could be added. She suggested options that would require both of us to agree to undo what had been done. "You still have full access," she said, as if access were the same as ownership. I asked if I could open my own small account, separate, just for day-to-day needs. "Of course," she said, and slid a form toward me. Her pen was heavy, the kind that makes you aware of your hand. It took only a few minutes to answer the questions someone else had once answered for me. When she asked for a name for the account, I said, "Household supplies," and smiled to myself at the old habit. It was not a secret. It was simply mine. On the way home, I stopped at the shuttered building that used to be our community hospital. A chain-link fence wrapped its empty shape. Through the links I could see the brick faded to a color I could not name. In the side lot, a pile of broken plaster looked like snow that would never melt. I stood at the fence long enough to feel foolish, then reached into my bag and touched the library printouts, a paperweight pressing down the impulse to shout. I didn't want noise, I wanted accuracy. I tore a small corner from one of the printouts and pressed it through the fence's diamond gap, a worthless gesture, maybe. But I knew the wind in this town, and how it carried what didn't belong to the ground. Bara arrived at the house that afternoon with clear plastic bins and labels. She said she was helping me streamline the living room. She said less clutter would make life easier. She used the word safety the way people use sugar to cover something sour. I watched her hands move through my shelves and drawers with a speed that belonged to someone cleaning a hotel room. She held up a stack of old cards and letters tied with a ribbon, and asked, "Do you need these?" I said yes. She smiled, wrote cards on a label, and placed the stack into a bin that wasn't the one marked keep. I corrected her, and she lifted the stack, slowed down, and set it in the right container. I told myself vigilance would be enough. She kept talking, filling the air with compliments about my taste in quilts and frames. Words that sounded like kindness until you measured what her hands were doing. By evening my living room looked like a brochure spread. The edges were sharp, the surfaces cleared. It did not feel like my life lived there. Laura took a bin to her trunk, promising to have the contents scanned and organized. "You'll thank me," she said. I stood on the porch and watched her drive away with a box that did not belong to her. I ate dinner standing at the counter, because sitting felt like a claim I could not make yet. Daniel called while I was rinsing an apple. He sounded pleased with how productive the day had been. He said the website was gaining attention. He talked about hosting a small event to introduce the vision. He called it a private celebration. Said the phrase like it was a gift. Private celebration, he repeated again, as if aching to hear it land. He proposed a date and a rented hall. "We'll invite key people," he said. I asked if the invitation list would include me. There was a pause. Then he laughed. Light and quick, "Of course, Mom. It's your event." After we hung up, I took out a stack of index cards and wrote names from memory. The cards formed a small column by the sink. I wasn't writing phone numbers, I was writing moments. The woman whose husband held my hand so tight during a code that my knuckles bruised. The teenager whose broken arm I splinted while her mother paced the hallway in socks. The old farmer who smelled like hay even in December, who told me a joke about cows right before his surgery and made me laugh so hard I had to turn my face away. I did not have their numbers. I had the shape of their names and the rooms where we met. I kept writing until the cards felt heavy. The next day I walked to the post office to ask about bulletin space. The clerk pointed to a strip of cork behind a row of poo boxes. "Nothing commercial," she said. "Only community notices." I told her I had no business to sell. She nodded. I pinned another index card with the same line I had written at the library. "If I ever held your hand in a hard night, I'm hosting a small thank you no gifts. Just your name. E.S." The clerk read it silently, then reached for a stamp, inked it, and pressed a red circle beside my initials. Not official, just visible. At home. Harold was in his chair, a baseball game murmuring from the television. I stood in front of him holding the brochure as if it were an indictment. "I need you to call Daniel," I said. "Tell him to stop using my name." Harold lowered the volume and looked past me at the window, where the late afternoon light made dust float like snow. "He says this is good for the family," he said. "It gives us standing." The word standing lodged under my ribs. Standing had never fed a child or sat up with a fever. Standing didn't mop a floor or drive a neighbor to chemo. Standing was a photograph in a frame, not a life. I told him we did not need standing, we needed truth. He nodded without agreement and turned the volume back up. That night, the town group online lit up with a thread about the new venture. I knew because Rebecca sent me a link with a short note. "Thought you should see." She lived in Chicago. My daughter of 46, always measured, always walking a line, so precise it barely existed. The comments on the thread ran in two directions. Some praised the idea using my name as a banner. Some questioned whether I was really involved. A man I recognized from church wrote, "Evelyn was nice, but I'm not sure she did anything visionary." Another said, "This is Daniel's doing, obviously." The phrase obviously wound around my throat. I could have typed a sentence to set it straight, but I didn't. I closed the laptop and sat with my hands flat on the table until the urge to explain drained out of them. In the morning, A postcard arrived, addressed to me in a neat corporate font. It was an invitation mock-up, private celebration, honoring Evelyn Stroud. The back listed a website for RSVP. There was a QR code. A note at the bottom said, "Dress, smart casual." Daniel's signature appeared, this time real, his pen carving loops into the cardstock. The card looked like a kindness and felt like a theft. I placed it under the magnet on the refrigerator beside an old photo of Harold and me holding newborn twins in a hospital room that no longer existed. I took the bus to a strip mall and bought a small spiral notebook. On the first page, one copied the library sentence that had felt right in my hand. On the second page, I wrote a date for myself, not for Daniel. I wrote a place too. The community hall near the church. The one with scuffed floors and a smell of floor polish that clung to your coat. I would rent it myself with cash from my new account. It would not be a launch or a reveal. It would be something quieter, more precise, outside the store. An older woman paused at the bench and looked at me as if she knew me from somewhere she could not place. "You were at the hospital," she said finally. "You held my mother's hand when she was afraid." I nodded, and she put her palm briefly on my arm. A touch meant for steadying herself and, maybe, me. "I never forgot," she added, then walked away toward the bus stop. It took little to make me feel visible again. It took even less to remind me how easily visibility could be taken. Before bed, I opened the fridge and looked at the invitation. One more time, its perfect corners, catching the kitchen light. The headline used my name as a promise for a room I hadn't chosen. I took it down, flipped it over, and wrote a single line on the blank side. "My celebration will be private when I decide what private means." I pinned it back up backward, my handwriting facing out. Harold glanced at it while filling his water glass, squinted, and said nothing. The next morning I woke early, pulled on my coat, and walked to the church hall. The custodian unlocked the door for me because he remembered me from years of blood drives and flu clinics. The floor smelled like lemon oil. I counted chairs in my head, not because I expected a crowd, but because counting is a habit nurse keep when the stakes matter. He asked why I needed the room. I said, "Thank you, gathering." He wrote my name in the ledger and scratched the pen tip over the paper until the ink took cash deposit. He said. I slid the bills across. His hand hovered for a second, then closed over the money, rough knuckles and all. "You always paid an exact change," he said quietly, almost fond. "Some people remember." On my way home, the wind pushed against me. I set my shoulders and leaned into it. The town had not changed much in looks, but people change without telling you, and then act surprised when you don't know how to read them. At the library board, my index card had a thumbtack through each corner now, someone's way of saying it should stay. A new card pinned beside it read, simply, "I remember." No name, just the words. The corkboard meant for lost dogs and piano lessons had become a quiet ledger of names you can't scan or digitize. That afternoon I received a text from Daniel, with a link to a video he'd recorded in his car, smiling into the camera, asking the community to support a family initiative to modernize care. He said my name 3 times in 30 seconds and never once said he loved me. Laura commented with a heart. Harold watched it and nodded like a man trying to see the best in a painting he did not understand. I clicked save on the video, not to keep it but to remember the exact tone of his voice when he spoke about me as a brand. Small details matter when you are charting a case. Before sleep, I set the new notebook on my nightstand, a pen on top. I wrote 3 names I hadn't thought of in years, and a 4th that filled itself in without effort. My hands have grown slower, but they still remember the shape of care. I closed the book and lay back. The house groaned the way old houses do when the heat ticks on. I listened to that familiar sound and decided what I would say if anyone asked me why I was doing this. I would not talk about brochures or websites or cards. I would say, because my name is mine, and because silence is not kindness when it erases the truth. I turned off the lamp. In the dark, the refrigerator motor started, steady and low. And a cool line of light slipped under the bedroom door from the kitchen where the invitation on the fridge hung backward. My sentence scrawled across its blank side in thick blue ink. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a plan. It was a line I had drawn in my own hand, and for now, it was enough. Rebecca arrived 2 weeks after the brochures began to circulate, driving down from Chicago in a car that looked more like a company lease than a family vehicle. My daughter, 46 now, sharp in her suits and cautious in her tone, stepped into the kitchen carrying a tote bag with the same efficiency she carried herself. She kissed Harold's cheek, patted Daniel's arm, and when she turned to me, she smiled as though her face had been trained for it. I waited for warmth, for recognition, but what I received was formality. "You look well, Mum," she said, the kind of phrase people use when they don't mean to stay long. Daniel wasted no time. He pulled Rebecca aside, placed the glossy brochures on the counter, and spoke as if I wasn't there. "We're finalizing the paperwork this week. With your signature, it'll be seamless." I asked what he meant. Rebecca glanced at me quickly, then back at him. "It's just a family trust, Mom, nothing complicated. It protects assets, makes things easier." I heard the word easier again, that soft weapon they wielded against me. I asked to see the documents. Daniel slid a folder across the counter. My name appeared on every page, bold as if it were a headline, followed by phrases I didn't understand: licensing rights, legacy branding, community ownership. The ink smelled fresh. I saw lines for signatures, spaces where decisions had already been made. Rebecca stood beside me, close enough for me to smell her perfume, and said gently, "It's just formalities. You don't have to worry." I looked at her hand resting near the pen. She had always been my careful child, the one who carried books stacked high, the one who memorized phone numbers before anyone else did. I remembered nights when she was young, when she would sit beside me at the hospital waiting room, watching me chart notes because Harold was on the night shift. She had learned stillness from me, and I had believed it would turn into strength. Now, that stillness turned into silence. When I refused to sign, Daniel's smile thinned. "We'll move forward anyway. Rebecca can sign as secondary." I stared at him, the words heavy in the room. Rebecca avoided my eyes. She reached for the pen and signed where her name was printed. Her handwriting neat, efficient, unhesitating. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper felt louder than the refrigerator hum. I didn't shout. I asked why. She said, "It's better than a fight. You know how you get when things spiral." Her words landed like cold water. The daughter I had raised to stand upright had bent in the name of peace. She thought silence was kindness. She thought surrender was protection. I saw then that my greatest fear wasn't only being mocked, but being erased with the help of those I had trusted most. That evening I sat on the porch while the others discussed timelines inside. The street lamps buzzed faintly. A neighbor walked his dog past the house, nodded, and asked about the new venture. I nodded back, unable to explain that my life had been converted into a brand without my consent. When he said, "It's wonderful, what Daniel is doing for you," I only answered, "Yes." Words tasted like ash again. Later, in the living room, Harold dozed in his chair while Daniel spoke on the phone in the kitchen. Rebecca sat beside me, scrolling through her phone. I asked if she believed I needed this project. She didn't look up. "It doesn't matter what I believe. Daniel won't stop this way. At least, you're included." Included, the word was an insult, as though my life were an afterthought to be added in at the end. I excused myself and went upstairs. In my room I opened the spiral notebook I had bought. The first pages already held names from memory. I added one more, Rebecca. I didn't write her number. I wrote the word silence beside her name. The next day, Laura returned with another bin of my belongings. She said she was helping me clear space. Among the items missing from the shelves were several letters tied with blue ribbon notes, from families of patients I had tended through the years. When I asked where they were, she said, "Daniel has them. We're scanning them for the archive." Archive, another word that turned living moments into artifacts. I checked the bins myself. The ribbon was gone. My throat tightened. Those letters were not his to take. They carried the voices of people who trusted me in their most fragile hours. I found Harold in his chair and demanded to know if he had agreed to this. He rubbed his forehead and said, "Laura said they'd be preserved. Paper fades." His logic was as thin as the paper he dismissed. He had handed over the only pieces of proof that I mattered, and called it practicality. At night I couldn't sleep. I imagined those letters fed into a scanner, reduced to pixels, stripped of their weight, and then filed away or thrown out. My life turned into data, detached from the smell of ink and the weight of a hand that once pressed pen to paper. The following morning, I walked to the town square. A community board hung outside the post office, filled with ads for lawn services and babysitters. My small card still hung there, thumbtacked firm. A new note had been pinned beneath it. You sat with my father when he was dying, I remember. As I touched the paper lightly, my chest eased. Somebody remembered. That memory could not be scanned or sold. When I returned home, Daniel was waiting in the driveway. His car gleamed, his suit crisp, even on a Saturday. He held a stack of contracts. We're moving fast, he said. You should be proud. I told him pride didn't come from paperwork. He grinned, confident, dismissive. You'll see at the celebration. Everyone will know your name. He meant his version of my name, the one he had repackaged and sold. That evening Rebecca left for Chicago. She hugged me at the door, light, almost absent. She whispered, "This way, it hurts less." Then she was gone. The taillights disappeared down the street, and the silence left behind was worse than Daniel's laughter. Inside, Harold asked if I wanted tea. I shook my head. The kitchen smelled of lemon cleaner from Laura's afternoon scrubbing. The counters gleamed, bare. The empty space where my letters had been stored felt like an open wound. I stood there, my hands resting on the edge of the sink, and promised myself I would not be erased quietly. That night, I opened the spiral notebook again. The list of names grew longer. Each name carried weight, not because of the contact number, but because of the memory tethered to it. I wrote slowly, deliberately, pressing each letter hard enough to leave an indent on the page beneath. This was not a directory, it was a ledger of truth. Rebecca's silence, Harold's passivity, Daniel's arrogance, Laura's efficiency layer by layer. The walls of my life were being stripped, but walls can be rebuilt. Memory cannot. I would keep writing. I would keep remembering. And when the time came, I would not let them dictate what my legacy meant. I closed the notebook, set it on the nightstand, and turned off the light. The dark pressed close, but it was mine. For the first time in weeks, I slept without fear. The box of letters vanished without explanation. I searched the closets, the basement shelves, even the attic where dust made my throat burn, but the bundle, tied with blue ribbon, was nowhere. Those letters had been my anchor, tangible proof that my life's work mattered to someone outside my own bloodline. I asked Laura, my daughter-in-law, if she had moved them. She smiled politely and said she was only helping with clutter. Her words were crisp, rehearsed, as if she had practiced denying me. The sharpness of her tone left no space for more questions. I turned to Harold. He sat in his chair by the window, looking at the yard as if the grass required inspection. "Did you let her take them?" I asked. His eyes shifted, not toward me but downward, at his hands resting on the armrests. "She asked," he said. "I thought it was harmless. She said she'd store them safely." My knees weakened. Harmless. That word had been stretched thin until it meant betrayal hidden under politeness. Days later, my grandson Michael arrived, 28, sharp in his suit but with an uneasiness in his step. He carried a briefcase that seemed too new to be broken in. He had just begun his career as a lawyer in Indianapolis, and his mother, Rebecca, insisted he visit more often since the new family project involved legal contracts. He kissed my cheek lightly, then sat with Harold at the kitchen table, flipping through papers Daniel had left. Michael glanced at me. "Grandma, these documents, they give Daniel complete control of your likeness. He can use your name, your stories, even your photographs." His voice held restraint, as though he didn't want to alarm me, but his furrowed brow betrayed him. Harold cleared his throat and muttered, "It's not as bad as it sounds. It's modern practice. Branding." The word sliced. Branding. I had tended to the dying with my bare hands. Not to become a brand. I asked Michael about the letters. He frowned. "You mean the testimonials?" I saw some scans in Daniel's files. No originals, just PDFs. He looked puzzled. "Where are the real ones?" My chest tightened. I told him they had been in the box tied with blue ribbon, a gift from families across decades. Michael flipped through his folder, then shook his head. "They're not here." Later that evening, I overheard Harold on the phone with Daniel. His voice was low, deliberate. "Yes, I gave permission. Evelyn's not organized. It's better this way." I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. Better this way. My own husband had signed away the last physical remnants of my work, reducing my lifetime into files stored in my son's office. When Harold hung up, I stepped into the room. "Why?" My voice trembled, not from weakness but from rage held. "Too long," he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Paper doesn't last. Daniel's preserving your memory." My fists clenched. Preserving. He's replacing me. Harold rubbed his temples. You don't understand the world now. Things are different. His words felt like stones piled on my chest. For decades, I had carried his exhaustion from the railway nights, his silence at the dinner table, his stubborn pride. Now he repaid me with collusion. Michael witnessed the tension. The next morning, as Harold sat with his newspaper, Michael leaned close to me. Grandma, I'll look into this quietly. If those letters were yours, Daniel had no right to take them. His voice was steady, careful, yet not fully committed. He was young, still tied by loyalty to his father's image of family unity. But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the lawyer in him wrestling with the grandson. In the days that followed, whispers spread around town. At the grocery store, a woman stopped me between the bread aisle and the milk cooler. I saw your name on the new wellness campaign. Wonderful legacy, Mrs. Stroud. She smiled kindly, but her words pressed like salt into an open wound. She believed the narrative Daniel was crafting, that I was willingly handing my name over, that my children were carrying forward a proud tradition. No one saw the theft beneath the shine. I returned home with bags heavier than usual. Harold asked if I needed help lifting them. I told him no. His offer was too little, too late. The silence in our kitchen grew heavier each day, not from lack of words, but from words I could no longer trust. Michael came again the following weekend. He brought his laptop, spread documents across the table, and asked me questions about dates, patients, and my career. His method was clinical, legal, but beneath it I sensed a search for truth. You kept records, didn't you? He asked. I nodded. The hospital archives, but the building closed years ago. His eyes brightened. Then, there must be storage. Old files somewhere. I saw in him a glimmer of the ally I needed, though he still hesitated to stand openly against Daniel. That night, Harold went to bed early. I sat with Michael in the living room. The lamplight cast shadows across his face. He lowered his voice. Grandma, if those letters resurfaced, they'll belong to Daniel legally, because Harold gave consent. My stomach churned. Michael tapped his pen against his pad. But if we can prove they were taken without full knowledge, there may be grounds. He spoke cautiously, like a man testing thin ice. I asked him one question. Do you believe me? He looked at me directly, the first time since he had arrived. His eyes softened. Yes, I do. That was enough to keep my spine straight. The next day, Harold found me at the sink. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. Daniel has plans. He's strong. Let him carry it. I dried my hands slowly, meeting his gaze. Carry what? My name, my work, my dignity. He sighed. The sound of defeat masquerading as wisdom. At our age, what matters is peace. Peace. Another word used to cage me. I turned away from him and walked upstairs, gripping the railing tighter than usual. In my room, I opened the notebook again, adding Michael's name. Beside it, I didn't write silence. I wrote possibility. By then, the project Daniel was building had begun to draw attention in town. A banner hung outside the community center. Stroud Wellness Galanoring, the lifetime of Evelyn Stroud. The date printed on it made my breath catch. It was the same weekend as my birthday. I had not been told. My celebration had been stolen and repurposed. The cruelest part was that the community believed it was generosity. That night, as the banner image appeared on social media, I sat at my desk and stared at the spiral notebook. The names I had written filled pages now, each one proof of connections Daniel claimed didn't exist. My hand ached from writing, but the ache felt righteous. The betrayal of my husband granting permission, the silence of my daughter, the arrogance of my son, the complicity of my daughter-in-law, of it converged into a single truth. They were not only mocking my empty contacts, they were rewriting me. But my story was not finished. I closed the notebook with care, slid it under my pillow, and let the darkness settle around me. For the first time, I was not afraid of being erased. I was preparing to fight. The church bell echoed across the town that Sunday morning, each tolling note cutting through the winter air like a reminder of time itself. I had not stepped into Reverend Paul Harris's church in years, not because of loss of faith, but because the walls of that place had begun to feel like they belonged more to Daniel's generation than to mine. Still, something pulled me there. I needed grounding, a place where my name had once been spoken with dignity, not as a marketing slogan. Reverend Harris, a man in his late 60s, with a voice that carried the weight of both sermons and funerals, greeted me at the door. His handshake was firm, his eyes searching mine as if he knew I carried more than the Bible in my hands. "Mrs. Stroud," he said, "it's been a long time." His tone was respectful, but I heard the faint hesitation, the echo of town gossip. That must have reached even him. He led me to a pew near the front, where sunlight filtered through stained glass and spilled across the wood. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. After the service, he stopped me before I could slip away. "Evelyn, may I speak with you?" He guided me to his office, a small room lined with shelves of worn books and faded photographs of parish events. He sat across from me, hands clasped, voice lowered. "I've heard about Daniel's campaign. People are talking." He paused, studying my face. "But I also remember something Daniel never mentions. Years ago, you were nominated for the National Nursing Award. I recall receiving a letter asking me to provide a statement about your service." My chest tightened. "I never saw such a letter," I whispered. Reverend Harris frowned. "That surprises me. The letter was addressed to your household. It must have reached someone." I returned home that afternoon with a heaviness in my bones. The sun was already sinking when I stepped through the door. Harold sat in his chair, the same chair where he always sat, as if his body had molded to its shape. I asked him directly, my voice steady, "Did you ever see a letter about a nursing award from years ago?" His paper crumpled slightly in his hands. He didn't answer at first. Then, without looking up, he said, "Yes." The single word carried the weight of decades. I stood frozen, the floor beneath me no longer steady. "You saw it?" He nodded slowly. I thought it was better not to tell you. You were already overwhelmed with work, with the children, with me. I didn't want you chasing recognition." His voice was flat, a justification rehearsed over 40 years. I stared at him, the man I had shared my bed with for over half a century, and felt as if a stranger sat before me. "You kept it from me." He set the paper aside, finally meeting my eyes. "You didn't need it, Evelyn. You had us." The cruelty of his reasoning hollowed me. All those nights when I had doubted my worth, all those years I wondered if my service had been invisible to the world. He had held proof in his hands and chosen silence. My anger surged, not as fire, but as ice, cold and cutting. "You decided, for me," I said. He said nothing more, only leaned back in his chair, eyes dull with a tiredness I no longer pitied. The next day, I went through the attic again, searching. Dust covered everything, but beneath boxes of Christmas ornaments and Harold's old railway uniforms, I found a small wooden chest. Inside were scraps of memory, my children's report cards, photographs, Harold's union papers, and there, tucked between two folders, an envelope yellowed with age. The seal was broken, my name typed neatly on the front. Inside, a letter dated 40 years ago, from the National Nursing Association. It congratulated me on my nomination and invited me to a ceremony in Chicago. The words blurred through tears. I could not stop. At the bottom, an apology. "We regret you did not respond by the deadline." I sank onto the attic floor, clutching the letter. My life had been altered by a choice that was never mine. Harold had stolen not money, not possessions, but acknowledgement, the kind that cannot be bought or replaced. The silence of the attic pressed around me until I could hardly breathe. That evening, I placed the letter on the kitchen table in front of Harold. He glanced at it once, then looked away. "It doesn't matter now," he said. My voice shook. "It matters because you decided my value. You erased what could have been my moment," he muttered. "It wouldn't have changed anything, but it would have. Not in fame or fortune, but in dignity. In knowing that the sleepless nights and aching hands had meant more than survival." I left the letter on the table and went upstairs, where I added another name to my notebook, Reverend Paul Harris. Beside it, I wrote, "Witness that." In the days that followed, I felt the sting of whispers grow louder. At the post office, 2 women glanced at me and murmured about the gala banner. At the pharmacy, the clerk asked if I was excited for the tribute Daniel was planning. Each comment deepened the wound, because they praised an event built on theft and silence. They saw my name, but not me. Michael visited again, and I showed him the letter. He read it slowly, his jaw tightening. "Grandma, this is serious. If Harold concealed this, and Daniel is now exploiting your reputation, we might have leverage. Documentation like this could prove you were recognized officially." His words carried the precision of law, but his eyes carried something else. Sorrow. "Why didn't you know?" he asked. I told him the truth. Harold had chosen for me. Michael's shoulders stiffened. "I'll scan this," Keep the original hidden. If Daniel learns of it, he'll claim it for his campaign. For the first time, Michael's loyalty seemed to shift, no longer balanced between his father and me, but leaning toward justice. That night, I dreamt of the Chicago ceremony I never attended. I saw a room of white uniforms, hands clapping, my name called out. Then the dream fractured, replaced by Harold's hand pressing the letter into a drawer. I woke with the bitter taste of loss, a loss measured not in years but in what might have been. I rose before dawn and sat at my desk. The notebook lay open, pages filling with names. Each one reminded me that I was not invisible. But the letter reminded me of something else, that invisibility had been forced upon me, even in my own home. I picked up my pen, writing not only names but words that had been buried: nomination, recognition, betrayal. As the morning light seeped through the curtains, I understood something with sharp clarity. They had mocked my empty contacts, erased my letters, concealed my honor, and rewritten my story. But I was not empty. My silence had been shaped by others, my worth decided without my consent. That era was finished. The letter sat beside me, fragile yet indestructible, a relic of what had been stolen, but also a weapon of truth. I no longer looked at Harold as my partner in age. I saw him as the first betrayer, the one who had set the pattern that Daniel now perfected, and I knew, as I closed the notebook, that every name I wrote was a step closer to reclaiming what had been denied. The invitation arrived, not by post, but through Michael. He handed it to me with a hesitation I could read instantly. "Dad wanted me to give this to you," he said, setting the glossy envelope on my table. I opened it slowly. Inside, a gold-trimmed card announced a company gala hosted by Daniel's firm, with my name printed beneath bold letters, honoring Evelyn Stroud, community nurse emeritus. It was not an award from any hospital, nor a recognition from any medical board. It was my son's corporate branding, dressing my life in a costume that did not belong to me. For days I wrestled with whether to go. My instinct was to refuse, to shield myself from the charade. But each time I looked at the letter from the National Nursing Association, the nomination stolen by Harold, hidden in silence, I felt a push. Perhaps if I stood in that hall, people would see me. Not through Daniel's lens, but with their own eyes. Against Harold's sighs and Laura's smirks, I decided to attend. The gala was held in the largest hotel ballroom in Indianapolis. When Harold and I walked in, escorted by Michael, the air was thick with perfume, expensive suits, and the hum of networking. A massive banner hung above the stage, from care to corporate, honoring a legacy. My picture, a stiff portrait taken at Daniel's request weeks earlier, loomed beside it, altered to look polished, detached from the lines of age that told my true story. Laura, dressed in a gown that shimmered under the lights, approached with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Mother," she said, emphasizing the word as if it were foreign to her tongue. "You must be so proud." Behind her eyes, I saw calculation. This was her theater as much as Daniel's. The program began with speeches. Executives praised Daniel for his leadership, his innovation, his family values. When they mentioned me, it was not as a nurse who walked through blizzards to reach patients, or who held dying hands in midnight silence. Instead, I was cast as the symbolic foundation of Daniel's brand, the heart that inspired his empire. Each sentence turned my decades of service into a slogan. Finally, Daniel took the stage. At 53, his confidence filled the room. He gestured toward me, seated in the front row. "This evening, we honor not only my mother, but the spirit of dedication she represents. Without her, I would not understand resilience, commitment, or community. Tonight, she stands as our emblem." He paused, and a spotlight struck my chair. The crowd applauded, rising to their feet. For a moment, the sound washed over me, but it was not applause for Evelyn, the nurse who had given her youth to a town that barely remembers her. It was applause choreographed by Daniel, applause meant to elevate his image while reducing me to a statue. I sat frozen, trapped in the light, a living prop. Harold leaned toward me and whispered, "Smile." His voice was not advice, but instruction. I turned to him, and for the first time in our marriage, I did not obey. My face remained still, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The applause grew louder, cameras flashing, but I gave them nothing. After the ovation, Daniel stepped down, kissed my cheek, and whispered words meant for me alone. "Now they'll remember you, Mom. You should thank me." I stared straight ahead. Gratitude was not what burned inside MIT, was humiliation sharpened into clarity. Later, as the evening drew to its close, Daniel unveiled a plaque, my name engraved beneath his company's logo, accompanied by the title, Symbol of Service. I stood there, the weight of false honor pressed against my chest. Symbol, not nurse, not healer, not woman, just symbol. Michael caught my eye from across the room. He looked away quickly, but I saw the shame in his face. He knew, he saw the difference between reverence and exhortation. When it was over, Harold drove us home in silence. My hands trembled, in my lap, not from age but from fury, contained too long. At the house, I went directly to the attic. The letter from Chicago lay where I had hidden it. I held it up to the plaque Daniel had presented. One was truth, fragile and yellowed with time. The other was fabrication, polished and permanent. Between them stretched the chasm of my life, the recognition denied and the recognition stolen. In that attic, surrounded by the dust of decades, I felt the weight of it all collapse into one realization. Neither Harold nor Daniel wanted me to be known on my own terms. Harold had silenced my worth in private. Daniel had twisted my worth in public. Both had decided that my story was theirs to control. I carried the plaque downstairs and set it on the table beside the letter. Harold glanced at it once, then looked away. I asked him, "Do you see the difference?" He said nothing. I pressed further. One tells the truth, the other tells Daniel's lie. Still silence. His indifference was worse than Daniel's spectacle. That night, I wrote in my notebook longer than I had in weeks. I recorded every detail of the gala, every false phrase uttered, every applause that rang hollow. And I added Clara Jenkins's name, remembering her from years ago. Clara had been my colleague, the one who pushed me to apply for awards, the one who insisted our work mattered. If anyone would remember the truth, it would be her. I closed the notebook and looked at the plaque one final time. My son thought he had given me honor. What he gave me was fuel. His stage lights, his banners, his orchestrated ovation. They had stripped me bare. Yes. But in that exposure, I saw myself more clearly than ever. I was no statue. I was flesh, memory, and will, and I would no longer be silent. My phone lit up before dawn with a red badge I had never seen climb so high. 327 missed calls stacked on the screen like tally marks. For a heartbeat I thought Mark had finally realized what he had done, or that Ruth had decided to stop standing on the fence, or that Arthur had taken a bad turn in the night. I tapped the recent list. The numbers were unfamiliar, rotating area codes from Los Angeles, New York, and a corporate exchange 2 towns over. The voicemail counter showed 47. I slipped on my glasses and pressed play. A woman's voice, crisp and practiced, introduced herself as business affairs for a national studio. She said she needed to verify ownership and personal authorization concerning Caldwell's Diner and related media materials. She said her team had attempted contact repeatedly. Another message, a man this time, identified himself from the compliance department of a fast food conglomerate. He referenced a licensing agreement with Mark and a pending series order that required chain of title confirmation from the founder. He used phrases I had only ever seen in contracts Janelle had translated for me: warranties, indemnification, founder release. All of it sat there on my kitchen table, in the form of a humming black rectangle and a list of calls set on repeat. They had not been calling to check on my health. They had been trying to reach the person whose name they had erased. I forwarded the audio files to Janelle, then called her. She answered on the first ring and asked to come by. Within an hour she was at my kitchen table with her laptop open, fingers moving quickly over keys while she listened. She replayed each message, typed notes, cross-referenced numbers, and pulled up public filings. She did not waste words. When she finished, she told me the calls meant the outside companies had found holes in Mark's paperwork large enough to swallow a franchise. She pointed to a timestamp and said the flood started after a routine audit. She asked me to save everything and not return a single call directly. She would establish a written channel and force them to put their questions and fears on record. I brewed coffee while she typed a short notice and sent it to every voicemail address attached to the calls. The note stated that I had retained counsel, that all communication must be written, and that any meeting would occur with representation present. She CC'd my new email account, the one she had set up for me when this began. She asked if I was ready for a long day. I told her the day had already begun. Before noon, a courier arrived with a thick envelope addressed to me from the studio. Inside was a formal letter on heavy paper, acknowledging receipt of council contact, followed by something that made my hands go still, a log summarizing every attempt to reach me. The total matched my screen. At the back lay copies of the documents Mark had provided to secure his deal. My name appeared only as a subject of inspiration. The line labeled founder listed Arthur and Mark. The line labeled assignment attached Arthur's signature from decades ago, copied into a new document authorizing media adaptation, sublicensing, and merchandising. The date of the signature was wrong by a lifetime. The breath I took felt thin. Arthur shuffled into the kitchen and asked why a courier had appeared. I handed him the founder page. He studied the block letters and the pen strokes that claimed to be his. He said it looked like his own hand, but older he would not look at me. He said he did not remember signing anything like that. He said Mark had dropped off a stack long ago and called it housekeeping. He sat down heavily and coughed into his fist as if the air had thickened. Mark's car pulled into the driveway. Later that afternoon, he let himself in and found me at the table with the log of calls spread in order. He said the calls were nothing to worry about. He said large companies always circle when they see potential. He said he would handle it. He asked for the envelope. I covered it with my hand and told him he would speak to Janelle. He smiled like a man humoring a stubborn child. He said he had already spoken to a senior vice president and that everything was fine. He said I should focus on moving day. I asked what moving day meant. He said a care coordinator would come for a home assessment because I deserved comfort and attention. He said a waiting list had opened at a facility with a nice garden. He said Ruth had agreed it was wise. At sunset, a woman with a clipboard arrived, wearing a badge with the title care manager. She said she had a scheduled evaluation for safety and daily needs. She explained that adult children often request assessments when a parent's stress increases. She began walking through rooms, counting rugs and measuring hallways, noting medications and labeling the bathroom as a high fall risk. Arthur stood there mute. One found forms on her clipboard already, populated with my birth date and Mark's signature, in the field marked responsible party. She asked about my phone use and whether I ever felt overwhelmed managing calls. I told her my calls were manageable and that the evaluation was over. I said no further visits would be permitted without my attorney. She wrote a sentence that sounded like non-compliance and left with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Ruth called later from the church office. She did not ask how I was. She said the studio had put the series on temporary hold pending ownership confirmation. She said the grant for the youth roof repair that Mark had promised might be at risk. Her voice trembled not with sympathy but with pressure. She asked if I could sign a simple statement to bless the project and ease everyone's burden. I told her I would not discuss signatures by phone. I told her these matters would go through council. She was quiet. She said the community was watching. I told her the community had eaten at my counter for 40 years and that I would not vanish because a contract wanted me to. By morning, Janelle had secured a conference with the studio and the restaurant chain. She insisted on a written agenda and a recording. She also requested a copy of every version of the chain of title. The meeting began at noon, over video. I sat at my kitchen table with my spiral notebook open, the old diner's chalkboard menu propped against the wall, and my phone face down. On the screen, a grid of faces appeared: business affairs, corporate counsel, a production executive with a bright backdrop. They spoke in careful tones. They said during due diligence they found material misstatements. They said a father-son assignment contradicted public records and local histories they had begun to receive once rumors spread. They said their own brand risk increased daily. They asked for my confirmation. Was I the founder? Had I ever sold or assigned my creative contributions? And did I consent to current exploitation of the Caldwell name? I answered in the same steady voice I had used while explaining procedures to anxious patients. I told them I opened the diner before Mark hit high school and before Arthur's back gave out for good. I told them the menu, layout, and rituals were mine. From the way the counter clock swung above the griddle to the Sunday pot pie that sold out before the noon rush. I told them I never sold my stories, my recipes, or my name. I said I had recordings and notebooks from a lifetime behind that counter that could prove origin and continuity. I said I would not stand as a prop while someone else cashed the check. I did not raise my voice. I did not recite law. I described what was true. The call went quiet. The business affairs woman cleared her throat and said they would suspend production and freeze all deliverables until they received documentation. She said they would request immediate written assurances from Mark's company and that a failure to cure would trigger remedies in their contract. She said they would prefer to speak directly with me regarding any future rights if I chose. She stayed on script, but her eyes softened when she said my name. I watched Mark's structured tilt in her careful words and felt no triumph, only gravity. 2 hours later, Tessa's email arrived like a flare. The subject line invoked family unity. The body accused me of sabotage, of misunderstanding, of senility. She said the care manager had reported risky conditions and urged me to cooperate with placement for my comfort. She CC'd Ruth, as though to enlist the authority of a pulpit. She attached a revised release form with my name pre-filled above a signature line. I forwarded the message to Janelle and returned to my stove to stir soup. I had fed whole townsmen their lunch on mornings after layoffs. I knew how to keep a steady hand when men shouted about things they did not understand. Janelle replied, on my behalf, with a letterhead that did not tremble. She stated that any defamation concerning my capacity would be met with action. She demanded preservation of all documents, emails, and recordings. She set a deadline for the return of my letters and photographs, which she described as irreplaceable cultural artifacts under my control. She requested that all future home visits be scheduled through council. She did not argue. She set the table. The local gossip boards began to churn that evening. A former line cook posted a memory of opening prep at 4 a.m. and finding me on the stool with a ledger and a tape recorder, practicing the day's specials out loud so the cadence would fit the morning rush. A retired school bus driver commented that the diner's senior discount had saved him during a winter when fuel costs ate his paycheck. None of it mentioned Mark. All of it named me. I did not reply. I watched the thread pull a shape out of fog. Arthur moved through the house like a man underwater. He avoided my eyes and my stack of documents. He folded dish towels with thick fingers and set them down in neat squares. After dinner, he asked if we could let Mark resolve things quietly. He said families break when lawyers get involved. I told him families also break when the truth is replaced with an easier story. He sat back and stared at his hands. I had seen those hands build booths for the diner when money was tight. I wondered if he remembered wood shavings on the floor, and my gratitude when the benches took shape. The next morning, a plain envelope arrived. No return address, just my name in ballpoint. Inside was a photocopy of an internal memo from the studio. The sender remained unidentified. The memo noted that multiple attempts to reach the founder had failed because a gatekeeper kept interceding. It mentioned that once direct contact was established, the founder had engaged counsel and disputed the veracity of assignments. It recommended immediate pause and a compliance investigation. I felt the smallest exhale leave my chest. The outside world was no longer nodding along to Mark's story. I went down to the basement after lunch and pulled 2 milk crates from under a tarp. Inside lay microcassettes with handwritten labels and a blue order pad with grease shadows worn into the paper. I found a player that still turned and fed it a new battery. The tape clicked and a younger voice filled the room, mine, calling out orders and reminding myself to set the blueberry pie before the morning rush. The background hum of the griddle crackled faintly. A bell dinged just before I announced a pickup. The sound had weight, like a witness sitting down in a chair across from you and folding its hands. I did not need the studio to tell me what those tapes were worth. They were the sound of a place that belonged to me. When I climbed back up with the crates, my phone buzzed again. The call screen displayed one of the studio numbers. I let it go to voicemail and watched the count climb to 48, learned that not answering can be an answer. The message said a senior executive would be in town and requested a brief visit at my convenience. Janelle texted and said we would meet at her office under recording and with an agenda. The ground had shifted. I could feel it in the way people addressed me, less like a subject, more like a source. Before bed, I carried the chalkboard menu from the basement to the kitchen and propped it against the refrigerator. The slate was pitted, the paint on the border chipped. I picked up a piece of chalk and wrote one number in the corner where the soup of the day used to sit, 327. Under it, I wrote a single line for myself, not for them. If I am so forgettable, why do you keep calling? I set the phone beside it and turned off the light. The house did not feel like a staging area anymore. It felt like a workshop again. The calls would keep coming. The emails would multiply. Mark and Tessa would pull every string they had tied around my life. Ruth would weigh budgets against truth. Arthur would stare into the middle distance and look for words he did not have. I could not change them tonight. I could only keep my records, guard my voice, and prepare to lay the pieces on the table where everyone could see. The basement waited below with its tapes and its order pads. The church ledger waited down the street with Ruth's careful handwriting. The bank manager's memory, Mr. Keating's, waited behind a desk that had seen every family in this town sign away pride for a few months' relief. The studio's investigation waited in its sterile office. The show's set designers had probably already mocked up a fake version of my counter. None of them could recreate the sound of my morning voice on that cassette, or the way a regular's laugh bounced off chrome tile when the first cup of coffee hit. I had been told I was forgettable. My phone now argued otherwise. 327 times in a week, people with contracts and budgets had tried to reach the woman they had written out of the story. I was no longer guessing at their motives. Their own logs told me they were afraid, and fear is the closest thing to honesty some people ever show. I climbed into bed, the chalkboard glowing faintly in the kitchen, the number white and stubborn in the dark. The handset lay quiet for once. I knew the silence would not last. The next day would bring the meeting, and after that, the proof. I placed my hand on the spine of the spiral notebook beside me and closed my eyes, not to escape the noise, but to rest before I turned it into a record no one could ignore. The crates sat in the middle of my living room, floor like stubborn reminders. I had pulled them up from the basement the night before, dust clinging to their plastic lids, the smell of grease and ink still faint in the cardboard folders tucked inside. I set my phone beside them and played the first cassette again. My voice, at 38, rang out, sharp and efficient, calling orders to the griddle while the clatter of plates followed in the background. The tape was no relic. It was evidence. It carried my cadence, my handwriting made audible, the rhythm that had defined for decades of mornings. When Janelle arrived, she leaned down and lifted the top crate. She was not sentimental. She handled it like a paralegal sorting an archive. She opened a blue spiral notebook, yellowed around the edges, with lines of names in my neat cursive regulars, orders, notes about shortages, even addresses of those who had owed tabs I had allowed to stretch. She flipped through silently, then closed it with care. "This isn't nostalgia," she said. "This is ownership." I watched her load the recorder with fresh batteries and play another tape. The bell of the service window chimed. A man's voice, Tommy, one of my line cooks, back then, asked me if we needed more pie shells. I answered on tape, brisk and certain. Janelle pressed stop and looked at me. "You just proved authorship of process. It's like a manuscript. They can't replicate this." I felt my throat tighten. For months I had been treated like an obstacle, a name to be erased, a fragile old woman better off tucked away. Yet here, in my own cramped handwriting and the raspy sound of my younger self, lay something irrefutable. I did not need Mark's permission to claim it. That afternoon, Janelle organized a small gathering in her office. She invited Mr. Keating from the bank, who arrived with a folder of photocopied loan agreements. He was courteous, but his eyes lingered on the crates at my feet. When Janelle set a cassette on the table and pressed play, he heard my voice cutting through static. He listened for half a minute, then leaned back. "That's not something you can fake," he said. Arthur sat beside me, silent, his hand gripping the arm of his chair. His face looked older than his 81 years. When Janelle asked him if he recalled signing the assignment Mark had used, he hesitated. He admitted Mark had slipped papers in front of him, called them updates for insurance. He said he hadn't read them closely. I turned to him and asked if he had ever heard me sell the rights to our name. His eyes dropped to his. "Shoes?" He whispered no. Janelle began drafting a formal declaration of authorship. She asked me to read passages from the notebooks into her phone's recorder, then compared them to the tape cassettes. She explained how the law viewed continuity of style and control of method. She spoke with the certainty of a woman building a scaffold brick by brick. I followed her instructions, reading aloud the way I used to at the counter when calling specials to customers. By evening she had arranged another call with the studio's lawyers. This time she placed one of my tapes on speaker, letting my younger voice announce an order of hash and eggs. She paused the tape, then cued me to read the matching note from the order pad. The lawyers were silent. One of them cleared his throat and asked for copies. Janelle said certified copies would be provided under seal, pending their withdrawal of any recognition of Mark's contract. That night, Mark stormed into my house without knocking. He pointed at the crates stacked by the couch and demanded I stop. He accused me of trying to destroy his future, of siding with vultures. His wife Tessa stood behind him, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the room with disdain. She said no one wanted to hear about grease-stained notebooks or scratchy tapes. She said television was about vision, not memory. I told them the tapes were not memory, they were evidence. They carried timestamps, dates, and the authentic sound of a business that had lived inside my bones. I told them the diner was never theirs to sell, because you cannot sell what you never built. Mark shouted that I was senile, that no one in the industry would take me seriously. But Janelle had already sent digital transfers of the tapes to a secure server, and she reminded him that destroying originals would be obstruction. His face darkened, but he said nothing more. 2 mornings later, I received an email from the studio. They had suspended all development. They noted potential material misrepresentation in Mark's filings. They requested a meeting with me directly to explore authentic rights. The email closed with a line that stopped me cold. The integrity of Caldwell's diner rests with Mrs. Verena Caldwell. The same day, the gossip boards exploded. Someone had leaked a short clip of the tape, my voice calling out pie orders. The background filled with laughter and clatter. Old customers began posting memories, their birthdays, at my booths, their first jobs, bussing tables, the sound of me greeting them by name. Each post carried weight. People tagged one another, adding stories. Within hours, Caldwell's Diner was trending in our county, again not as a product of Mark's contracts, but as the heartbeat of a town. Arthur finally spoke to me that evening. He admitted he had hidden things from me, signed papers without understanding, stayed quiet when he should have defended me. He said he thought keeping peace with Mark was the same as protecting family. He was wrong. His apology was not grand, but it was raw. I listened, then told him what mattered now was whether he would stand beside me when the world asked who truly owned our story. He nodded, tears cutting lines through the wrinkles of his face. Janelle arranged a press statement. It was brief. I was the founder. I had never sold or assigned my rights, and I possessed contemporaneous records. She attached a scanned page of my order notebook, my handwriting crisp and exact, dated from the year the diner opened. The release spread quickly. Calls from reporters began. This time I answered none. I let Janelle filter, because I had learned that silence can hold power. Mark and Tessa responded with their own release, full of bluster, accusing me of fabrication. But the community had already seen enough. Photos from my notebooks were circulating, matched against town yearbooks and newspaper clippings. People remembered. They remembered me behind the counter, my hair pinned back, my apron dusted with flour. They remembered the bell above the door and my voice calling their names. For the first time in months, I felt steady ground beneath me. Not safety. This battle was far from over, but ground. My phone, once a source of dread with its flood of missed calls, now buzzed with messages from strangers thanking me for their childhood meals. The calls that once mocked me as forgettable had become proof that they could not erase me. The crates stayed in my living room. I wanted them visible. Every tape, every notebook, every grease-stained page was a stone in the foundation I had laid. No contract could unwrite it. No son could silence it. No spouse's silence could bury it again. The battle for Caldwell's Diner was no longer about contracts or signatures. It was about proof of a life lived, recorded in ink and voice, and I had it. When I lay down that night, I knew the final confrontation was near. Mark and Tessa would not surrender quietly. Ruth would have to choose between her pulpit and her mother. Arthur would have to testify to the truth. The studio and the chain would weigh risk against heritage, but for the first time, I was not afraid. The diner had always been more than a business. It had been memory made tangible, a rhythm sung in plates and voices. And now, with the tapes humming on my table and the notebooks spread in plain sight, I had reclaimed its soul. No matter what came next, the world would hear it. The courthouse smelled of old wood and stale coffee. I sat on the front bench, my back straight, the tapes and notebooks stacked neatly in front of me. My hands rested on them, firm and steady. Around me, the air buzzed with whispers. Neighbors, reporters, strangers curious about what they had. SEEN online. Caldwell's Diner had become a headline again. But this time, the story was not filtered through Mark or Tessa. It was mine. The judge entered. Papers shuffled. The bailiff called for order. I looked across the room. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his jaw tight, his suit crisp, as if polish could hide the cracks running deep beneath his posture. Tessa leaned in close to him, whispering, but her eyes darted like a trapped animal's. Ruth sat further back, her clerical collar peeking from beneath a dark coat, her face caught between duty and guilt. Arthur was beside me, his hands folded. His presence was quiet, but finally aligned with me, not against me. Janelle stood to present our case. She was sharp, deliberate, not theatrical. She began with the recordings. My voice filled the courtroom. Younger, brisk, alive, calling out orders over the hum of Breakfast Rush. There was no mistaking it. Each tape carried my cadence, my name woven into the rhythm of the diner. Then came the notebook's pages of orders, signed notes from customers, lists of supplies, all in my hand. Janelle placed them beside the cassettes, like bricks in a wall no one could scale. Mark's lawyer argued contracts, signatures, debt. He waved papers Arthur had once signed, claiming rights had shifted decades ago. But when questioned, Arthur admitted he never understood the fine print, that he had been misled. Mr. Keating, the banker, confirmed no original assignment existed, transferring ownership of the brand. The courtroom shifted. I felt the tide. The most damning moment came when the studio's representative stood. His voice was flat, professional, but his words cut through the air. We reached out to Mrs. Caldwell after discovering discrepancies. We have 327 call records to prove it. We recognize her as the authentic origin of Caldwell's Diner. Gasps rippled. The number, once haunting me in silence on my phone, now thundered in open court as proof. Tessa tried to interject, but her voice cracked. She accused me of hoarding memories, of sabotaging progress. The judge silenced her. Then Ruth stood, unprompted, and walked to the witness box. Her voice shook, but she told the truth. She had known about the deal, had kept silent because the church was promised funding. She admitted her betrayal openly. For a moment, I felt the air leave the room, yet her confession was the final blow. The judge delivered the decision plainly. All rights to the name and story of Caldwell's Diner reverted to me. Mark and Tessa were found liable for misrepresentation and fraud, their contracts void. The studio was ordered to negotiate only with me as rightful originator. The gavel struck once. Silence, then a swell of voices. Some clapped, some whispered my name. I stood slowly. Mark glared at me, his face pale, his career unraveling before the public. Tessa looked away, lips pressed tight. Ruth wept, her hands covering her face. Arthur reached for my arm. For the first time in years, his grip felt steady. In the weeks that followed, the diner's name spread again, but not as a flashy TV brand. Articles told the story of a woman whose voice had been nearly erased, of how she fought to be remembered on her own terms. Old patrons sent letters. Some even mailed copies of photos of themselves sitting in my booths decades ago. Caldwell's Diner was no longer just a building that had closed. It was a memory carried in living people, one I had reclaimed. I declined the studio's offer to build a show around me. I told them the diner's story was not entertainment, it was community. I permitted a documentary instead, one that would include the tapes and notebooks as they were, unpolished, real. That was enough. The house grew quiet again, but not with the suffocating quiet of before. Now, it felt like rest after a storm. The crates still sat in the living room. I kept them visible, as anchors, not relics. And as I sit here now, reflecting, I see the journey for what it was, not victory in the sense of triumph, but survival of truth. For those of you listening, wondering what lesson there is in all this, I'll say it plainly. Family will not always guard your history. Sometimes, they will rewrite it for their own gain. I learned that silence, even from those closest to you, can wound deeper than open betrayal. But I also learned that the proof of a life lived, your work, your words, your voice, can outlast manipulation. If you guard it, do not expect gratitude from those who benefited most from your sacrifices. Protect your own record. Write your name on what you've built. Keep your evidence close. That is not cynicism, it is survival. And if they try to erase you, remember this: memory kept by one determined hand can outweigh the schemes of many. I share this not with bitterness, but with clarity. My story is not just mine, it belongs to anyone who has been told they are forgettable, invisible, replaceable. I promise you, you are not. So if you carry scars like mine, hold them as proof. Stand your ground. And when the time comes, let your own voice, whether on paper, tape, or memory, speak louder than those who tried to bury it. To everyone watching, I thank you for walking through the dark with me. May you carry the strength to face your own. And if you wish to continue alongside me for the next stories, subscribe here, quietly, steadily. We have more battles to unearth, and I would like you beside me when we do.